I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Hey friends, Abdu Murray. Welcome back to All Rise. This is a podcast where we take a look at objections against and claims in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective, looking at evidence and these kind of things. What you heard to start off this podcast was a very well-known dialogue between Tom Cruise, Lieutenant Dan Caffey, and Nathan Jessup, a colonel in the Marines, in the very famous movie A Few Good Men. In fact, it's one of the movies that got me to want to be a lawyer in the first place. I had always been sort of thinking about becoming a lawyer, but this movie sort of sealed the deal, as it were. I can't say that the courtroom scenes were terribly realistic in every sense of the word, but it makes for good drama, let's put it that way. Well, it got me fascinated. And of course, this whole dialogue has become very famous when someone wants to say that you can't handle the truth because they give you something that sounds like it counters your worldview or it counters your thinking on something. And so we see this all the time, and it's made into jokes, it's been made into memes and all that kind of thing. Today's episode is going to be a little different than the usual episode. It's going to be a little more self-reflective on my end, but also I think it's going to be more of a call for self-reflection on all of our ends. I don't know if you're a Christian or an atheist or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist or an agnostic or whatever you might be. As you're watching this or listening to this, we have to ask ourselves constantly, I think, as a matter of just understanding and looking at evidence, understanding and looking at worldviews and examining our own destiny, our own eternal destiny, if there is such a thing. Do we look for truth, or do we look for things that fit the worldview we want to be true? And we have a lot of reasons for wanting certain worldviews to be true. Why do we look at them in a certain light? Why do we take certain evidence and say, this is evidence that I want to be true, or that I want to bolster my own worldview? And everyone is subject to this. It's called confirmation bias, but I want to get a little more personal about it, because you can talk about confirmation bias in sort of a cool and objective way. And confirmation bias, in case you don't know what it is simply this, that people, because we are inherently biased towards our own views, people will take a set of evidence, and even if it's undisputed evidence, and they'll interpret it in a way that actually fits the conclusions they've already drawn, or the conclusions that they would like to draw. Even though I, for example, will look at evidence, let's say it's propositions A, B, C, and D, and I'll say that's conclusively proven that A, B, C, and D are true. And I'll say, because those things are true, it fits my worldview, or it fits the conclusion I want to reach on a political view, or on whatever it might be. Or, when it comes to religion, or just societal issues. Then you might look at that same evidence, A, B, C, and D, and you also will concede that those things are actually true. But then you'll look at them in a way that favors your worldview or your conclusions, even if they're the polar opposite of what mine actually happen to be. I think of like debates on abortion or on death penalty issues, or whatever it is. We tend to look at things in a way that favors our points of view. That's called confirmation bias. And every single person, no matter who they are on the planet, actually has confirmation bias. And so the issue is, can we actually recognize it in ourselves and then overcome it? You see, as a society, we all like to talk about how commitment to the truth is all important. Truth is what matters. And we say that if we don't have truth, then we don't have anything. We often say these platitudes, but you see, everyone, believer or non-believer, comforts their own ego by entertaining within themselves the idea that they are a lover of truth, and that to them, truth is the highest ethic. But seldom do we live truly like that. I think to recent history, in terms of like in the 90s. I remember I was in law school, and in the 90s, there was this big scandal, of course, and it rocked the highest offices in the United States, where the president of the United States had lied directly to the American people. And then the polls came out, and we decided that we could put truth on the back burner because the economy was good and we didn't want to rock the boat. This, of course, I'm referring to the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, where the president of the United States actually lied about having an affair. He actually lied about it under oath. during a deposition. But this scandal sort of rocked the nation, and it became the topic of news all over the place. But the consensus was, not consensus, I should say, but the strong feeling was across many spectra of society in the West, and especially the United States, was, hey, we can't have impeachment. We can't have someone removed from office because that could rock the boat. Things were going really well. But in a little bit more recent history, here, and I'm from the Metro Detroit area, in actual Detroit proper, there was quite a bit of controversy similar to this. In fact, the facts were almost on a parody, where the mayor of the city of Detroit was caught in a deposition lying about having an affair. And there were several issues, other issues involved in this particular matter, but he basically perjured himself under oath, saying that he wasn't having an affair when in fact he was. Now, the economy was down. In Detroit, things weren't going so great. People were very frustrated. And yes, there was back and forth about whether or not the mayor should be removed from office or there should be criminal prosecution. But I would say in the main, most people had thought, yep, we need to hold this man to a standard of truth. We need to hold this man to a standard of integrity. And in fact, he did, in fact, go to jail. Now, it's interesting because you look at the two different circumstances. You see the highest office in the land where someone had committed perjury about an affair. Then you see the highest office in a particular city where the person in power had lied under oath about having an affair. And you see two different approaches to the consequences of what should happen. There's many factors, I think, that could be attributed to the decision level of the public about what should happen. But I think one of the things we have to carefully consider is that in the first instance, things were going well. There was an economy that was doing well. There were so many things that we didn't want to change and upset. And in the second instance, things weren't going so well. So what do we have to lose by holding someone to account? My point is this, that in the first instance, we recognized that the truth had been sullied, that somehow there had been a lie that had happened. But because of our comfort level, we did not want truth and the consequences of holding somebody accountable to that truth to rock the boat. In the second instance, things weren't going so great. So why not? In other words, the truth mattered suddenly because it didn't cost us anything. I think of the humorous short poem by Judith Viorst about the duplicitous attitude of humanity toward truth, and it's a sort of a trivial way to look at it, but in one sense, it actually really gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? About how we look at evidence, how we look at truth. She wrote this, I made him swear he'd always tell me nothing but the truth. I promised him I would never resent it, no matter how unbearable, how harsh, how cruel. But how could he have thought I meant it? The whole point is that you ask somebody, how do I look today? And they tell you what you want to hear. But the reality is if they told you what you ought to hear, you might be offended by it. We ask questions not always wanting the actual answer. We want someone to actually tell us what we would like to hear, not what we need to hear. It was C.S. Lewis who pointed out this sort of discomfort we have with truth. And he said this, if you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. That's really important. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. But if you look for comfort, you will get neither comfort nor truth, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. I think this is such a profound statement and one we have to constantly keep in mind, because what Lewis is telling us is that if you look for truth, comfort can get thrown in. You won't always be comfortable. Truth has a way of making us uncomfortable. I once heard someone say that pain is what it feels like when you bump into reality. And I think that's a profound reality of our existence. And what Lewis is saying, though, is that you may find comfort in some facets, but also truth can be uncomfortable. But if you look only for comfort, if that's the primary thing you look for, if you look to have your worldview confirmed, you will get neither comfort nor truth in the end. It may seem like soft soap. It may seem like something easy to go through. Then you realize you're engaging in wishful thinking, but in the end, it will lead to even greater consequences than just discomfort. It will lead to despair. And that's something we have to make sure we're constantly on the watch for. See, why do we act so duplicitously when it comes to commitments to truth about worldviews or anything else, because truth has a price. It has a cost. There's an emotional barrier to changing your worldview. I think about this. If you were to hold, and I may have said this before on previous episodes, but it's worth actually talking about once again, is that oftentimes, we hold an opinion with an open hand. If I have an opinion about something, let's say it's about a particular brand of shoe, or if it's a political opinion or whatever it is, some we hold a little more closer than others, but many opinions we hold with open hands. It can be changed. If someone wants to take it out and replace it with another opinion, you're willing to do that. But a conviction you hold with a closed fist. Not in an angry way, but in a tight way, because we hold our convictions dear. And in fact, sometimes they form our very identity. And so we hold them with a closed fist, a clenched fist, as it were. And if you try to pry someone's fist open so that they're willing to concede a point, you end up with a lot of pain. The person whose fist you're trying to open up and pry open, they have a lot of pain. And if you try to do it, you have a lot of pain as well. Seeing your own biases, or trying to point out the biases that someone else might have, can be a very, very tough affair. And so that's why oftentimes just presenting the facts as they are, presenting the evidence as it is, and saying, this is the evidence, and it seems to lead quite logically to this possible conclusion. If that conclusion is counter to someone else's worldview, they will either see the evidence in a way that helps their worldview, or they will see the evidence as false, even when it is demonstrably true, or the logic of your conclusion as erroneous or invalid, even when the logic of your conclusion is obvious and it's there. We've all had this experience where someone who's bright and intelligent and erudite and all these things and their understanding will look at you and they'll nod when you give them the argument, when you give them the evidence. And you're wondering, they're nodding, but they're not accepting it. And you're wondering, how it's possible? How is it that we're not getting through? It's because they're being polite. And if they start to respond in a more hostile way, or at least hostile to your view, not hostile to you necessarily, you begin to wonder, how is this otherwise intelligent, bright, well-meaning person not getting this? And the answer may be because they're not looking at the truth of what you're saying. They're looking at the consequences of what you're saying. And you have to ask yourself this question too: are you doing the same thing? Now, I'm going to tell you, friends, I know this aspect all too well. Many of you know my story. Not all of you know my story, but I came from a Muslim background. I did not come from a Christian background. I did not want Christianity to be true. I wanted one particular worldview to be true. And I knew that there was going to be consequences to my identity and other things if I became a Christian. And so it took me a long time to wrestle with the evidence, and it's okay if it takes you a while. You're supposed to wrestle with it. But it took me a long time, not because the answers weren't actually there, but because the cost of what it might mean was so great that it prevented me. It took me 9 years to come to faith in Christ, even though I think the answers were quite obvious now that I look back on it. Now, we need to understand something very important, I think, is that we often know somewhere, whether it's conscious or subconscious, we know what things cost, but we seldom know what they're worth. You see, in this entire conversation where we talk about whether we can handle the truth, and in that dialogue back and forth in the movie, there was an effort to get at the truth. But one of the things that Jack Nicholson's character, Nathan Jessup, actually points out is that, yes, there might be some uncomfortable things about life and even some things that we find abhorrent, but we can't handle the truth of those things because we want to allow unhealthy or otherwise dangerous truths to exist because it allows us to live in a comfort. We have to ask ourselves all the time, are we doing that? Are we engaged in that kind of thing as well, regardless of what our worldview happens to be? And that's how we look at evidence. So I'd like to focus, if we could, on not only exposing these biases, but also showing the value of what happens once we do expose them. Because in the movie, the ugly truth had to come out. And yes, might it have cost something? Might it have resulted in some negative consequences? Yes, but ultimately the positive consequences are so much better than the negative ones that we have to endure, whether in the short term or in the medium term, but in the long term. And I would say from the Christian faith, in the eternal term, exposing the costs that we have that prevent us from seeing the truth, engaging with those costs is far more important, it's far more valuable than any pain we have on this side of heaven, because the costs eternally are frankly unbearable. And so we have to bear that which is unbearable or seemingly unbearable on this side of heaven to see what's on the other side. At least to say, I've honestly assessed the evidence. Now, it can be quite profound, friends, quite profound. In fact, the cost of truth, the barriers to belief can be so profound that they actually get us to perceive reality in the wrong way. Let me give you an example of this. And if you'll indulge me, I'll talk about it right from the Bible. So Jesus is, of course, in the Bible, he's brought before Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea. And the high priest has brought him to be tried, and he's accused him of even sedition against Rome, or at least some level of trying to create an uprising against Rome, which is, of course, a false charge, but that's the charge because they need Jesus out of the way. Now, there's this interesting interaction where Jesus is standing in front of the governor of Judea, and Pontius Pilate, who seems to have all the power, is actually the one who's on trial here because his reactions to what Jesus has to say are the evidence about his heart and where he actually sits and who he actually is. So Pontius Pilate begins to ask Jesus questions about who he is, and Jesus says in John chapter 18, he says, "Everyone who is on the side of the truth hears my voice." Now, he speaks these words to Pontius Pilate as the Roman governor, participating in the trial of all time in this one sense, because it's not Jesus who's on trial, even though it seems politically that way. It's Pontius who's on trial. It's Pilate who's on trial about how he will react to the truth when he hears it. And Jesus specifically says, whoever is on the side of the truth hears my voice. Jesus is making an incredible claim here. He's saying that his voice is what truth sounds like because he claims to be the truth. And the one who is the truth would sound like Jesus. And so if you don't hear him, if you don't embrace that, then you're guilty of rejecting the truth and not wanting to hear it. Now, the whole dialogue in John 18, verses 37 to 38 goes like this. Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born. For this cause I have come into the world, that I may bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Then Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he said this, he went out, he walked out. Now, you could ask that question two different ways. See, Pilate had the right response in the absolute sense. When Jesus says, "Everyone who's of the truth hears my voice," Pilate could ask any question as a follow-up, and he asks a great question as a follow-up. He asks, what is truth? But he asks with a different attitude. You can say it like this. Well, what is truth? In other words, I actually want to know, what do you think is truth? Now, you might not have to agree with what someone says, but at least you asked it with a posture that is inquisitive. You want to know what the actual truth is. Or you could ask the way Pilate asked, which is, what is truth? In a cynical way. And he walked out. He did not want to hear the answer. Now, there's a movie, very, very popular movie, especially among Christians, but it was a popular movie in the mid or so 2000s called The Passion of the Christ. And it's a movie that describes the sort of last 24 hours of Jesus' earthly life before his crucifixion and his resurrection. And it gives this conversation that Pilate has with Jesus. Now, after Jesus is sent by Pilate away to Herod to be put on trial, because Pilate wants nothing to do with the situation politically, because he knows there's a lot of turmoil that's packed in here. If he condemns Jesus, Jesus' followers might start a riot. If he doesn't condemn Jesus, then Caiaphas, the high priest, and his folks who don't like Jesus as a religious rabble-rouser, they might start a riot. Now, there's a scene after Pilate sends Jesus away to Herod to be put on trial, thinking, I can wash my hands of this. This is Herod's problem. There's this interesting conversation that the movie The Passion of the Christ actually gives between Pilate and his wife Claudia. Now, it's not completely covered in terms of the Gospels. The Gospels don't give this level of detail about this conversation, but it's quite possible that it took place. And in fact, there is some biblical warrant for this because Claudia, Pilate's wife, is disturbed in a dream about Jesus and tells Pilate, don't have anything to do with this man. So there's this conversation where Pilate sends Jesus away, and he's sort of sitting there brooding, about the mess he's found himself in and what to do. And he just asks Jesus a question, what is truth, in a cynical way, and sends him away. So Claudia walks in, and Pilate contemplatively asks his wife this question, what is truth, Claudia? Same question, but now he's asked with a different attitude. Do you hear it? Recognize it when it is spoken? And she says, yes, I do, don't you? And he says, how? Can you tell me? And she says, if you will not hear the truth, no one can tell you. It's a matter of will. Now, Pilate's irritated by this. He's mad because he's in this predicament and he knows that there's going to be consequences either way. And so he stands up and he says, truth, do you want to know what my truth is, Claudia? I've been putting down rebellions in this rotten outpost for 11 years. If I don't condemn this man, I know Caiaphas will start a rebellion. If I do condemn him, then his followers may. Either way, there will be bloodshed. And Caesar has warned me, Claudia warned me twice. He swore that the next time the blood would be mine. That is my truth. Now, ancient historical sources do tell us that Pilate made his decision to condemn Jesus based on his fear of Caesar's hand and what would happen if he didn't. He didn't do it based on any ethical principles. But I want you to notice something. In this dialogue he has from the movie with his wife, Pilate uses the word truth quite a bit, but he doesn't actually talk about truth. He's talking about the consequences of truth. He's talking about the cost of truth, what it will cost him if he decides this way or that way. The actual merits, the actual evidence, the actual guilt or innocence of the accused has nothing to do with his decision. It has to do with how it will affect him. There's a spiritual eclipse, you see. And what I wanted to point out here is that Pilate was so blinded by the consequences of truth that he called those consequences truth. He says, you know what my truth is? And then he said that these terrible things would happen. That's not the same thing as the actual truth. The consequences of truth can be so strong that they distort the actual truth in our own minds. The problem is that Pilate knew all too well what it would cost him, but he did not know the value of what was going on. There are modern day examples as well. I think of Elie Wiesel in his book Night, where he chronicles what happens at the concentration camps, specifically at Auschwitz. And he's talking about what happened to his faith because of what he saw and experienced at Auschwitz because his family was separated. And on arrival at Auschwitz, the men and the women were segregated. And Elie Wiesel never saw his mother or his sister again. And he says this, never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke, that is, of the crematoriums. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. And a bit later, he wrote this. Some talked of God, of his mysterious ways, of the sins of the Jewish people and of their future deliverance. But I had ceased to pray. How I sympathize with Job. I did not deny God's existence, he says, but I doubted his absolute justice. Put a pin in that for a moment, because we're going to come back to that. It's not just those who are religiously minded or who go through some sort of trauma who might have a cost to pay. In other words, their trauma is so close to them that they can't find any evidence for God to overcome the trauma they faced. Many times it's just people who are in the intelligentsia, as it were. They just have this straightforward, at least seemingly objective assessment of the evidence. But I think of Thomas Nagel. And this is a famous quote, by the way, from Thomas Nagel, a professor of philosophy at New York University. And he said this, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my beliefs. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. That has almost nothing to do, what a candid statement, by the way, that has almost nothing to do with the evidence. What he's saying is that he's got a prior commitment against belief in God because he doesn't want the universe to be like that. And I remember sitting across or next to a professor at a dialogue I had done at a university in North America where we talked about some things about what actually constitutes valid evidence for God. And at some point during the conversation, he actually admitted that the idea that God could be in control of his life, that there could be a sovereign being who controls the universe or actually has a plan for my life, he finds that idea abhorrent. It doesn't matter what the evidence actually might be for pro or against, but the idea of itself is abhorrent. Now, I don't want to misrepresent him because I think he has other independent reasons for why he doesn't believe in God. But an important one was the idea that God could be a sovereign being, and that he finds abhorrent. What's interesting was, in the beginning of our dialogue, the first question that was asked of me and him, I want you to listen carefully now. The first question that was asked of me and him was this question: are humans determined? In other words, are we deterministically set in motion because we're chemical machines and that we respond to external stimuli and the world is just set up like dominoes and our beliefs aren't really beliefs, we just kind of like respond because we're chemical machines? Are we determined? Or are we free? Do we actually have free will? Now, I think we actually have free will, and I went and started discussing why I think that. What's interesting is that my atheist professor counterpart, who was a lovely man, by the way, he made a statement. He said, I find the question uninteresting and not really pertinent or valuable because we can't really know these things. And he went on and said to give reasons why knowing if we're determined or free doesn't really matter. That was at the beginning of the dialogue. By the end of the dialogue, he had said that the idea that there could be a sovereign God who's in control of everything, he found that idea abhorrent. Did you see the contradiction here? Is that the idea that maybe cause and effect, blind chance and cause and effect might determine everything and be sovereign over our lives. He found that uninteresting. But the minute God was injected into it, he found that idea abhorrent. There's no real difference here, except that God was suddenly abhorrent here. I think that's part of the cost. I think there's something there that allows a very intelligent person who's thought through a lot of things to not see a fundamental and inherent contradiction. Now, I think all of us as human beings can fall prey to this. I think about Christians who might see evidence that sort of counters their view, whether it's a theological view and other Christians bring it their way, like they hear some scriptures that's different than what you happen to think it actually says, who will cling to a belief only because it was the belief they clung to before, even when there's evidence that goes against them, because we have these same desires and biases. All of us have to ask ourselves these questions. So I asked you to put a pin in something, and that was to put a pin into the idea that we might lose our faith, or we might lose some sense, not just that God exists, but maybe that God does exist, but we just don't believe in his justice anymore. So Julie Exline out of Case Western Reserve University did an interesting study. Now, she got some surprising findings out of the study, but because of what she was studying originally, didn't necessarily have to do with the findings that she found. What she wanted to do was gauge anger levels at God across different religious people from different Christian denominations or different non-Christian religions. And so she had, in her sample sizes, she had Christians who ran the gamut of different denominations. She had Mormons. I think she had Jehovah's Witnesses. She had Muslims. She had Hindus. She had Jews. But also as a control, she had atheists, self-proclaimed atheists. And so she wanted to measure what denominations would allow for people to be able to express different anger levels towards God. What she found was quite surprising was that the people who were angriest, not about the idea of God, but at God himself, actually at God, were atheists. And what she had determined was that there were such a high incidence of people who didn't actually identify as atheists because they lacked belief in God, but they identified as atheists because they lacked belief in God's goodness. In other words, it wasn't you don't exist, it was you're dead to me for whatever reason. People often have intense emotional reasons for not wanting to believe something. As I sort of start to think through these things and bring them to a close before I get to a how-to on this, I want to raise something. It's an illustration, if you don't mind my doing so. The moon has this ability to completely cover the disk of our sun. When you look in the sky, you see the sun, and our moon can completely cover it. We have total solar eclipses. Now, they can be dazzling affairs, but it darkens the rest of the world when it happens, or at least the world under the shadow of the moon. That is interesting because the small dead rock of the moon, there's no life on it, it's this small dead rock, can block out the sun, which is millions of times bigger than the moon. And why is that? The reason is because the moon is so much closer to us than the sun. So I think about this and I think this small dead rock is so close to us, much like our pain, much like our biases, much like our confirmation biases, much like the costs we have to pay in changing our worldview. And it's so close to us that it can eclipse the bright shining light of the truth. It can eclipse the sun that's there because we've put our cost right in the way. So the question becomes, how do we, in our own life, see this, and how do we expose it? Let me give you a few ways to do this, to actually expose the fact that maybe we're biased against seeing the evidence. So one way to do this is to ask open-ended questions. Now, there is a legal hook here. As a lawyer, when you're doing a direct examination of a witness, you're allowed to do what's called open-ended questions. You ask questions like, how did you feel? Who was there? What happened next? Was anybody else in the room? In other words, those are questions that don't suggest the answer. They're just questions that actually look to pull out of the witness a response and hear the narrative. Open-ended questions are wonderful questions because they can actually get the full story out. And we want to hear people's full story. We want to hear people's, reasons why they either believe or don't believe. And we ask questions like, well, what did you find compelling about that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? Whatever it might be, these are important questions to ask. But when it comes to the intent of someone's heart, I think asking an open-ended question is a good thing. Now, I'm not saying ask closed-ended questions like or what's called a leading question in the law, where you're suggesting an answer, like a yes or no answer or whatever it is, where you're trying to trap somebody in something. No, you want to hear the information. So when it comes to the intent or the cost of truth or whether someone's really open to the evidence, I would ask open-ended questions like this. Let's assume for a moment that I gave you a compelling reason that the gospel's actually true, that Jesus is who the Bible says he is. Would you really consider becoming a Christian? What would happen? What could you lose? What would be the consequences of that? And this across the different spectrums, whether the people of different faiths in the Christian faith or people of no faith whatsoever. Ask them this question and let them fill in the blanks here, because there's always something. Are there things you would have to change about your career or your interaction with your peers or even the way you see the world? And then I'd ask them a follow-up question. Isn't that a great reason? Aren't those costs a great reason to not be open-minded to what I have to say or what the evidence might suggest about Jesus? Now, be prepared, friends. If you're a Christian and you ask that question, you have to be able to answer that question yourself. Turnabout is always fair play on these things. So you have to be willing to answer these questions yourself. The good news, I think, is that the evidence is strong enough and incredibly strong in favor of the Christian faith that you can answer that question honestly, but also be assured that there's great reasons for you to believe what you believe. So that's the first thing. Ask open-ended questions. I actually did this with a friend of mine some years ago. He was a coworker, and he was an atheist, and he would walk into my office sometimes, and he would say, "Oh, hey, I just heard some news that the God you think is so good and so wonderful let the whole roof of a church drop down on a bunch of his followers and killed a bunch of them. And then he would say stuff like that and he'd walk out. And we had the kind of relationship where we could challenge each other, and we did oftentimes. So one time he did this kind of thing, and I said, oh, wait, you can't just leave. We got to sit down and have a conversation about this. So we did. And I said, hey, what kind of evidence would it take for you to think that God actually exists? What would meet the standard? And he had quite a high standard, actually. And his standard was that maybe there was a golden cross in the sky for all to see, and that every morning what emanated from the cross was John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, and all this kind of thing. He says maybe that would be the kind of evidence that would be what you'd expect from a God who wants everyone to believe in him anyway. So that would suffice. So I remember thinking that's an incredibly high standard. And I wonder if even given that evidence, he would still try to find a way to not want to believe something. Now, I'm not saying all atheists are like this. I'm not saying that. But my particular friend, I think, might have had sort of this sort of leaning toward no matter what the evidence actually is, it's not going to be good enough. So I asked him a question. And I know a lot of his history. So I asked him this. I said, hey, you smoke, right? And he was a smoker. I said, when did you start smoking? And he said, about age 17 or so, 16, 17, something like that. And I said, so when you started smoking, you had evidence that smoking was harmful, right? And he said, yeah, I knew that. I said, and you had evidence that smoking was addictive, right? You had that evidence too. And he said, yeah, I know that. I knew that too. So did you dispute that? Was it in any kind of like dispute? Was the evidence clear? And he said, yeah. I said, so the evidence was clear that smoking was harmful and addictive, and yet you did it anyway, and now you're hooked on it, and you still do it. And he said, yeah. I said, so tell me again how it is that evidence matters to you. Because clearly, in light of all the evidence that smoking would hurt you, you still did it anyway. Isn't it possible that evidence isn't really as important to you as you think it is? Now, I think about that all the time with all of us. Is that sometimes we do things completely counter to the evidence. We believe things completely counter to the evidence because we want to. And sometimes, even when we know that the worldview or the thing we're holding on to is harmful to us. In other words, we can't always handle the truth. And when you ask someone open-ended questions, you can get them to see that. But the next thing you have to do is one of the hardest things there is to do, which is just listen. Is that when you ask a question, listen for the answer. But sometimes you don't even need to ask a question. Sometimes someone's issues completely bubble up to the surface. Their pain, their trauma, or their anger, or their evidence for why they don't want to believe something, or the personal reasons bubble up to the surface. And sometimes all you have to do is just listen and not talk at all. That's important. I've had that come up plenty of times where people would tell me what their hang-up actually is without me having to actually pull it out of them. They would just tell me at some point because I was a listening ear. Was I great at that all the time? No. But when it does happen, when you are available like that, you'd be surprised what happens. Then the third thing I would say is this. You have to commit to sticking by them when they pay the cost. People from Eastern religions or the Middle East, for example, or even here in the West, when you change your worldview, it changes a lot about your community. It changes a lot about your sense of identity. And you might point them out to this fact that, yep, there's a cost to pay in coming to become a Christian. But they may be wondering, when I pay it, if I pay it, where will you be? Will you be there with me? And that's why it's called the Great Commission. And that's why we make disciples out of people, not because we just give them a track with the 4 spiritual laws, or we do something like this, but because we need to commit to sticking by them and being family or community or a sense of support when perhaps they might lose it or risk losing it. And when you commit to them that that's going to happen, you'd be surprised how much more willing somebody is to admit that there's costs to truth for them, and being willing to hear the arguments and the evidence and the reasons for being a Christian when you give yourself of that commitment to them. You'd be surprised. But what is it worth? I've already said, we know what things cost, but we don't know what they're worth. Well, what is it worth? Well, I can say this in the Christian faith. Truth is always worth it. Truth is uncomfortable, but it's always worth it. But I can say this particularly of the Christian faith. If this message is true, then what it means is that neither you nor I can prove our worth to God. But what's even better is that we now know that we don't have to prove our worth to God, because the penalty and the debt we've incurred has been paid by someone who is ultimately worthy, because he is, in fact, God incarnate. And so there is a benefit that is beyond measure, because the things we look for, love, forgiveness, understanding, truth, self-awareness, all of these things are wrapped up in the Christian message, and we can explore them during the course of our lives and as we try to explore who Jesus actually is. That's why Colossians 4 verses 5 and 6 are the hallmark verse of what I try to do in terms of ministry, is when Paul says that we are to walk in wisdom toward outsiders. In other words, understand who they are and what baggage they bring to the table. Understand your own baggage and what you bring to the table. Answer the questions they're actually asking. And then he says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. Don't answer each controversy. Don't answer each question. Answer the person who's sitting across the table or sitting next to you on the plane. Answer the person. And maybe you'll show them something beautiful that they hadn't considered otherwise before. So there is that assurance of salvation, which is the ultimate benefit, the ultimate value from the possibility that this gospel is true. But there's also an assurance that the answers to our deepest struggles actually are there. We might not have them on this side of heaven. We might not know why God allows certain things to happen, like certain sufferings or death or tragedy to occur. But on the other side, if Jesus is who he said he was, and if you explore it and you're willing to consider that evidence and you find that it's true, then all the answers you don't have now will ultimately find their summation, their culmination, and even their comprehension on the other side of heaven. Maybe on this side, but definitely on the other side. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, then everything else has to have an answer to it. Because the God of the universe is the one who loves you enough to send his son to not only die on the cross, but to rise from the dead to give you that assurance. So you have these tremendous benefits to knowing who he is, but there might be a price to pay. And so as I wrap this up, I think of two quotes that I want to give you to ask ourselves whether it's the truth we have a problem with or our ability to handle the truth we have a problem with. And that is from a quote from C.S. Lewis once again about cost and who it is who really pays the ultimate cost for us. It's not just us who pays the cost when it comes to truth, but it's God himself. Lewis said this, but the great thing to remember is that though our feelings come and go, his love for us does not. It is not wearied by our sins or our indifference, and therefore it is quite relentless in its determination that we shall be cured of those sins at whatever cost to us, at whatever cost to him. Whatever cost there is, whatever penalty, whatever consequence coming to faith might have for you, I can guarantee you the cost to get you there, if in fact the Christian faith is true, was infinitely more for the God who pursues you. There's this poem I thought about from a woman named Jean Murray Walker. And it's called Staying Power. And it's in reference to and actually honors an atheist. But she's a believer, and she says this: like Gorky, I sometimes follow my doubts outside and question the metal sky, longing to have the fight settled, thinking I can't go on like this. And finally I say, all right, it is improbable. All right, there is no God. And then, as if I'm focusing a magnifying glass on dry leaves, God blazes up. It's the attention, maybe, to what isn't there that makes the notion flare like a forest fire until I have to spend the afternoon spraying it with a hose to put it out. Even on an ordinary day, when a friend calls, tells me they found melanoma, complains that the hospital is cold, I whisper, God. God, I say, as my heart turns inside out. Pick up any language by the scruff of its neck, wipe its face, set it down on the lawn, and I bet it will toddle right into the God fire again, which, though they say it doesn't exist, can send you straight to the burn unit. Oh, we have only so many words to think with. Say God's not fire. Say anything. Say God's a phone, maybe. You didn't order a phone, but there it is. It rings. You don't know who it could be. You don't want to talk, so you pull out the plug. It rings. You smash it with a hammer till it bleeds springs and coils and clobbered up metal bits. It rings again. You pick it up, and a voice you love whispers, hello. God is always in pursuit. If he's there, he's in pursuit. If the Christian message is true, it's a message of pursuit, that though you try to run from that phone, though you clobber it and all these things, and though you might even have animosity towards God, at some point, in the midst of something, in the midst of your sorrow, in the midst of your struggle, if we're sincere about it, if we say, what is truth, wanting to know what truth is, and not what is truth, wanting to reject what truth might be, the phone will ring, and a voice you love will whisper, hello. And with that assurance, maybe all of us can handle the truth. Friends, this has been Abdu Murray, and this has been All Rise. See you next time.